Awesome. Thank you, dude. Thank you. Yeah, now I feel kind of wimpy because I did actually, I was traveling. I had another speaking engagement last week. I was able to tune in while John was teaching for some of it. I was in an airport, and now hearing John's end story, I feel like a wimp for not joining in from the airport because, oh my God, that's not like the worst place you can do these things. So, but I am going to take the content that John went through with you guys last week, and we're going to start building on it today. So the focus today is going to be on identifying persistent connections, the different types, how to go about tagging them, how to go about identifying them. So what's the goal? In other words, so all right, so we want to threat hunt. Where do we even start? The first thing we want to look for is persistent connections. We want to look for, I have an internal system, it's talking to an external system, and it seems like they're doing it pretty regularly. My system's going steady with somebody out on the internet, and I don't know anything about that other system. Does it come from a good family? I just don't know. I need to look into this a little bit deeper. That's really where we're going with this. So if there's a constant connection, if it looks like it's automated, meaning it's not like a person who uses Google 3 times a day to do some searches. We're not looking for that. We're looking for, there seems to be some pattern to the way this thing is going about carrying on its communications. Those are the things we want to go after. And when we see them, we want to be able to explain it. We want to understand why they're there. Is there a business need for this? I'll loop back into this later, but one of the false positives we see sometimes is network time protocol. Network time protocol is very consistent in calling out to an external server every 15 minutes to 30 minutes, depending upon what operating system you're running. Same session size every time, every time it goes by. It is the epitome of a beacon, which is one of the things we're going to talk about, but it's a false positive. And when we look at that, we can say, oh, hey, there's a valid business need for that. My systems need to know what time it is. I can go and create a whitelist entry for that. So once we identify if there's a persistent connection, now we need to kind of go through and diagnose, is this something that's legitimate or not? That aspect of this will be part of next week's module. This week, we're going to just focus the whole thing on how to go about identifying those persistent connections. So why start here? C2 is really good these days at looking like normal traffic. Sometimes there's something a little off about it, meaning that it may be 100% protocol compliant, but if you're familiar with that protocol and how it works, if you've done a lot of decodes, you may be able to look at that and say, man, that just looks a little off to me. So sometimes there might be something you can go in and tag, but quite honestly, attackers have gotten really good at this. It's HTTPS traffic over the port you expect with a valid digital certificate. It's hard to distinguish from the other traffic patterns. So one of the things we need to do is we need to look at a large period of time, like 24 hours, because that helps us identify, is this actually normal traffic or not? Is there a pattern to it, et cetera. I'll dig into this more as we go through. But, that's one of the reasons why you want to go through and threat hunt. There usually isn't a signature to look for. We used to be able to say, hey, if the user agent is unique within the environment, if you look at the HTTP user agent and it's unique, that's something you got to take a look at. Oh, no, they're getting better at their spelling and, making sure the typing's right so that it looks like, Chrome running on Windows 10. So you might see that on occasion, but if you're relying on that to catch your C2 channels, it isn't going to work. The other is things like, we used to rely on threat intel a lot. Threat intel, quite honestly, is very similar to antivirus. And it's kind of gone the same way as antivirus. Go back 20, 30 years ago, and antivirus was great because you could push signatures out to people faster than viruses could propagate. With threat intel, it was kind of the same thing. They could push out lists of known bad systems faster than the attackers could cycle things. It's not true anymore. One of my previous gigs was working for security for an organization that was a registrar. So they used to hand out domain names. And one of the things I ran across was attackers that were cycling their domain name almost on a daily basis. So if you were going in and you were looking for a specific domain to label that as bad, by the time you labeled it as bad, too late, they've moved on, they've gone someplace else. Public cloud has become popular. So I've noticed that like a lot of these threat intel feeds, the IP addresses that show up in there are public cloud instances. Well, and for anybody who's used Amazon, as you know, shut your instance down, then turn it back on again. magic, you've got a new IP address, and now you're banning someone that had absolutely nothing to do with this thing taking place in the first place. So we don't really want to rely on threat intel for that. And I just wanted to toss out one example. I'll excuse me, I'll cycle back into this next week. But I went through about half of these IP addresses that you see here, and they're all dynamic, meaning that it's a provider that hands out these IP addresses, and it may live for an hour, it may live for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, but it's designed to be short-lived. So banning it really doesn't do any good. The other thing is how old is this entry? You know, so if it's an Amazon instance and you can tell me it was doing evil stuff 5 minutes ago, yeah, all right, that's worthy of going in and saying, don't talk to that IP address anymore. But if you're telling me it did something evil 6 months ago, and it's an EC2 instance, God, I don't care. That is so moved on by now. And as you can see here, this is showing a date for all of these entries, but look at the date. It's all exactly the same second. So this isn't when that IP was detected being malicious. That was just when some database export function was run. Well, that doesn't help me, because again, if it's an hour old, I care. If it's 6 months old, I don't. Don't put this on my list. So threat intel, it's not the best way to go about trying to find the bad guys on your network. You're going to get a lot of false positives. You'll see it flagging things, and you'll say, "Oh, good, it's doing something," but it's not the something you actually need to be focused on. The other thing I want to talk about real quick before we jump into this is techniques versus methodology. I don't want to just sell you a tool, you know, so this, you know, I made that very clear in the announcement for this. This will not be a sales pitch, and it will not be a sales pitch. I'm not going to sit down and say, hey, run this tool and look how awesome this stuff works. No. What I want to do is I want to show you the techniques and the methodology behind finding these persistent connections. How do we find them? What goes on under the hood? What needs to take place in order to identify if something's a persistent connection or not? So we're going to get really into the weeds on how this stuff works. Now, for some of you, you may look at this and say, oh my God, I've got tens of thousands of hosts on my network that are doing hundreds of thousands of connections each to IP addresses out on the internet. There's no way I could apply these processes within my environment. This information isn't any good to me. Let that go for now. I'm going to come back in a later module and we'll talk about tools. Tools that help automate some of these steps are going to come later. Today, the only thing I want to focus on with you is techniques. This is what needs to happen in the background in order to be able to find these persistent connections. So focus on the techniques only for now. I also wanted to address, you know, what type of C2 do we need to go looking for? So we do a lot of testing. You know, we've got customers that are going in and they're looking for, you know, command and control in the network. Some of them are in the middle of a pen test when it's happening, or a red team test. Some of them not. Sometimes it's the bad guys that are getting in. Sometimes it's the paid for attackers, the red teams that are getting in. And what I've noticed is that when you look at what C2 is hardest to detect, it's actually the red teams. The bad guys are pretty basic in what you do. And then when you stop and you kind of think about why they're doing what they do, this makes a lot of sense. For a bad person, their job is to generate money somehow. Now, that could be from stealing money from you. That could be from stealing information that has value. It could be, you know, if we get to nation state level, you know, breaking into your network is part of the reason they get paid. So for the bad guys themselves, they have a whole business model in place. And it's usually things like, you know, how am I going to get on your network and not get detected by your antivirus or whitelisting technology or whatever you're running on your host? Okay, once I do that, you know, how am I going to get the malware there in the first place? I need a successful, you know, spear phishing campaign. Then I need malware that won't get detected by your IV or your AV. Then I need a way, once I own your system, to monetize that somehow. And then I'm going to worry about C2. So when you think about the bad guys from a business perspective, you always focus on the thing that can have the biggest impact to your business model. For an actual bad person, it's the spear phishing and it's getting around the antivirus software that might be running. The C2 is almost like secondary for them. So until we get really, really good at tagging C2, the bad guys are actually relatively easy. It's the red teams that are hard, because if I'm getting paid as pen tester and I've got a client that's signed an annual contract with me, I might be able to take 6 months trying to break in. So to have
Wow.
something that only beacons once a week, it's not really functional, but that's okay. I accomplished my goal. So the red teams tend to be tougher. You want to
Right.
jump in, John?
Yeah, I do. And this seems counterintuitive. And this has actually led to a bunch of arguments in various places on like LinkedIn and Twitter and various watering holes at various conferences. But it boils down to exactly as you said. We see attackers that use command and control, and they go to quote unquote legitimate websites that have been compromised. Like it might be a mom and pop bicycle shop, and they'll use that as their command and control server. And as attackers for Red Team, we can't do that. So we'll use like
Yeah,
domain fronting and all kinds of really weird shenanigans to get around being detected. But you're right. And I think the other thing that's really disappointing is, the mother of all invention is necessity, right? And as an
exactly.
attacker, they can fail and try again, fail, try again, fail, try again. And as a pen tester, I have 2 weeks and I need to make sure that my C2 is going to be rock solid.
Yep. And also, as a pen tester, you're getting paid to write that malware. That malware is what monetizes things for you. It's why you're drawing your salary. For the bad guy, no, no, no. It's, they got to do the spear phishing. They got to do, there's many other steps before money gets made that they need to focus on as well. So they don't have as much attention to focus on this. They won't focus on this until this is the big problem. We're getting better at defending against spear phishing. That's the biggest target that I've seen right now, Bob. So where to start? So we've got a couple of things. We're going to start with network data. I'm going to work mostly with packet captures, Zeek data, because that's the most common thing that people have access to. Maybe you run Zeek, maybe you don't. If you don't, it's open source. You can download it and just use it. It's an awesome tool. Definitely, if you've never played with it, definitely worth it. But we want to make sure we can get a good fidelity with this, meaning that we want to make sure we're looking at large periods of time. So if you go in and you just do like a 5-minute packet capture, you're going to struggle to actually tag any C2 if it's there on your network. You want to work with 24 hours. Now, whether that's all in one file, if it's in 24 different files, that's up to you and how you want to go through and break it down. But the first thing we need to go through and do is we need to start breaking out IP pairs. So I need to look at every internal IP address on my network, look at who it talked to on the network, and now scrutinizing that to see, do any of those look like a persistent connection? If it connected to a system once and only once over that 24-hour periods of time, yeah, okay, I probably don't need to worry about that one anymore. If it talked to somebody, 20,000 times over that 24-hour period of time, yeah, okay, that's one I want to go in and pay a little bit more attention to. So let's start talking about long connections. So a long connection is, just as the name implies, a long connection. So in this case here, the attacker takes over an internal system. It has it connect out to a command and control server, and it just leaves that connection open all the time. If that connection gets torn down for some reason, maybe a firewall goes offline or whatever, connection immediately gets reestablished, and then it just starts going on communicating from there. It can be useful to not worry about the ports that are involved. In other words, we've seen C2 that'll actually go to different ports. So 1 second it might look like it's talking to SSH, the next second it looks like it's talking to TCP/80. There's an application listener grabbing everything coming off of TCP on the remote end, so it doesn't matter what ports they go to, they can jump around randomly and that's okay. It's also possible to jump protocols, meaning it starts off using TCP, might then later change to UDP. So when I look at my IP communication pairs, I might keep track of what ports and what transports are being used, but I don't try and get caught up in that. Look for overall communications that are taking place between the two IPs. So, excuse me, I think this kind of stretched off the end of the screen here. There should have been an arrow. Oh, there's an arrow right on the edge here. Okay, cool. But what I'm trying to convey here is that if I'm looking at a 24-hour block of time, if I'm seeing, the SYN at the beginning of the day, the FIN at the end of the day, or if these actually happen to stretch out beyond that. In other words, when I look at my packet capture, it starts after the TCP/3 packet handshake, and then I see data all day long, and I still don't see the FIN-ACK exchange take place at the end. Oh yeah, that's a long connection too. So I want to see the totality of how long it was communicating for. The other thing to keep an eye out for is not just the length of a specific connection, but the overall communication time between each of my pairs. One of the neat little tricks we've seen out in the wild is create a connection to my command and control server, excuse me, leave that open for an hour and then tear down the connection and open up a new one. And the reason for that is it's hard to detect as a beacon because it's only going off once per hour. So if I look at a full day, I only get 24 data points to work with. It's still enough to work with, but it can be difficult to tag it in that type of a situation. It's also not going to necessarily float to the top as a long connection because none of the connections are taking place for more than an hour's period of time. So it's almost like a hybrid between a beacon and a long connection, if you will. But that cumulative communication time, that's something that's worth paying attention to as well. Now, this gets a little funky. So we need to identify when's the beginning of the session, when's the end of the session. Now with TCP, this is pretty straightforward. You've got your TCP 3-packet handshake that takes place in the beginning. That's the beginning of my session. And I've got my FIN-ACK exchange at the end. Remember that there needs to be a FIN-ACK, that TCP is full duplex, meaning each half of the conversation is actually unique from each other. So I can run into a situation where, let's say you're a web server, I'm a client. I can say to you, get big, huge file.tar. And now I'm done. I send my FIN-ACK, and now you need to transfer that file to me. Well, you don't actually close the connection until after that file gets to me. And depending upon connection speeds, how big that file is, you might close the connection, 5 seconds later. It might be 50 minutes later. It really depends. So it's that second FIN-ACK that we want to look for before we actually say, yeah, that connection is considered closed. But because we got the flags to work with TCP, it's real easy to look at it and say, here's the start of my connection, here's the end. Pretty straightforward. UDP, though, is connectionless. So how to identify a long connection? Because if there is no state, technically, like after every packet exchange, I could have a new session here. This gets a little funky, because in some cases, that's exactly what it will be. And so UDP is weird in that, if you think about like syslog, I send a UDP packet to the logging server, but the server never sends me anything back at all. So I have one packet going out and that's it. Nothing ever comes back, and that's a session. But then you get to DNS, and with DNS, I send a packet, I get something back. I send a packet, I get something back. So there may be two. It's entirely possible to have it so that I send a packet and then I get a bunch of packets back after that. So how do I identify the start and the end of the session? The start right at the very beginning is easy because it's, hey, who sent that first packet, right? But now when does it close? What if I've got a certain port combination and I have a couple UDP packets go back and forth, and then I see exactly the same thing again 10 seconds later? Is that considered part of the same session? Is that a new session? How do I go through and identify that? So this is kind of a, it's open to interpretation thing. The most common that you see people do, or that you see a lot of security vendors do, is they set a timeout. They say, if I see the same transport and same source and destination port combination in source destination IP combination, again in 30 seconds, I'll consider it to be part of the same session. Now, don't get too caught up in this because it honestly kind of doesn't matter, meaning that if we're calling each packet exchange a session versus whether we're just kind of stringing them all together, we're still trying to look at total cumulative communication time. That's really what it kind of comes down to. So that 30-second timeout, that seems to be kind of an industry standard. That's what I tend to kind of go with when I'm looking at, was a new session created, yes or no? If there's been no packet traffic activity for 30 seconds or more, yeah, okay, it's new. If not, yeah, let's just consider it part of that same session. And you can handle the rest of your transports the same way because they're all connectionless. The exception is ICMP can be a little funky just because ICMP can actually be, unidirectional. It can be bidirectional. It can also be a response to another protocol, which is one of the things that makes it really unique. So UDP, ICMP can be a little bit hard to keep track of, but tag it the same way. If you see it more than once in a 30-second period of time and it's the same type code, assume it's part of the same session. Just handle it the same way as UDP and you'll be in pretty good shape. So how do I even look at this? So one of the simplest things you can do to look at how long are these connections lasting for is grab your traffic, throw it into a PCAP file, throw that PCAP file into Wireshark. And once it loads up in Wireshark, go to Statistics, Conversations, and click on the TCP tab, and then click on the duration column here. And that actually, you got to click it twice. And once I click it twice, that's going to sort it by longest duration connections to shortest, top to bottom. I also wanted to point out, I noticed this when I was going through this data, that some of these are actually, well, actually we'll see it on this tab here. UDP, it actually keeps track of timing, and it does the 30-second timeout thing that I was talking about. So we can look at this from both a TCP perspective and a UDP perspective. This number here, this is just how many instances of TCP did I see, how many instances of UDP did I see. So who are my longest talkers on my network? Well, here's my very first one right here. Here's my second one. So now I may want to start going through and investigating each of these. When you think about a little over 86,000 seconds is equal to a day, yeah, these are pretty close to being 24 hours straight. So these are pretty long connections. This would be something I'd want to go in and I'd want to investigate. With most things in Wireshark, you can do it through Tshark. I have not been able to find a way to generate these stats with Tshark. If anybody knows and when they want to, throw it in as a question or throw it in as a chat or something like that, that would be awesome. Because I think it would be really helpful if you could do this with Tshark, because now you don't need manual intervention. You can actually go through and just script this whole thing. Now, so that'll give me what are the longest communication sessions? What about that cumulative time I talked about? Well, one of the things you don't see in this screenshot, because it's off the bottom of the screen, is there's a little copy button down here. And if I click the copy button, I'm given two options, CSV format or YAML format. So I can save that information to my clipboard in either one of those two formats, and then I can paste it into some other tool and go through and process it that way. So here you can see, I just took all those sessions, pasted it in, I sorted out who was talking to who, and then I went in and said, okay, at the end of each set of sessions, I want to go in and just add up all those duration times. That'll be my cumulative time for communications between those two systems. So, again, what is that cumulative time? It's just that. It's just a combination of all the durations combined in together. If you've got, if you're like 100 megabit or less, this might be a real easy way to go in and calculate that. There's other ways too. I will get into that as we go through and start covering tools. And here's an example using UDP. So again, I'm seeing, this IP talking to that IP, going from port 5353 to port 5353. And notice it's got a time here of 388 seconds. So this has actually been running for, it's about 3 hours now or something like that. It's been running for a couple hours now. So again, it's doing that state table timeout thing that we're talking about. Oh, sorry, I take that back. Duration is over here, 82,000. So yeah, it's definitely been talking for a couple hours now. But I can look at this with UDP the same way I can go in and look at it with TCP. I can also get this information out of Zeek. So if I'm running, if I have Zeek running on my network, if I go in and I take a look at the con.log file, the con.log file, part of what it keeps track of is how long are each of these connections that are taking place. So I can go in and I could go in and extract this information out of the log files to just say, give me the source, the destination source and destination IP address, the amount of time of the duration, excuse me, sort them all together, add them up. This would be pretty easy to write a bash script around. And this one kind of surprised me. So when I first started thinking about where do I get long connection information from, my first thought was, oh yeah, get it out of the stateful firewalls, because hey, they got a state table. State table's got to keep track of timing. That'll have this information in there. Turns out, how wrong could I be? Most firewalls do not actually keep track of the duration of the connection. There is a timing value that's kept track of, but what it keeps track of is the time to live. The time to live is how much time has expired since the last time I saw a packet. Because with a stateful firewall, there's two ways to remove entries from that state table. One is to close the connection. So let's talk TCP because that's easiest. If it sees a set of packets go by, if it sees a reset ACK go by, it says that connection's done, boop, pull that state table entry out. I don't need to worry about this one anymore. I can't count on every state table entry being removed, though, under normal communications. Meaning, what happens if I have two systems talking to each other from each side of that firewall, and one of them powers down? Well, now that connection can never finish, right? It'll never close up. So what we do with a stateful firewall is we say, okay, we're going to set a timer. Once this period of time expires, could be a minute, could be an hour, it depends on the firewall itself. But once this period of time expires, pull that state table entry out. So the timing you tend to see in firewall state tables is how long has it been since the last time I saw a packet in that session? Because once that duration matches the state table timeout, I'm going to remove that entry. I have found a few instances where you can extract this information. I've given examples for BSD, GNOS on here, where that information is actually tracked. But most of the firewalls I poked around and took a look at, there's actually no way to get it out of duration. So you're kind of back to, doing the packet capture thing. There may be some network performance tools to keep track of that too. I honestly haven't, dug into it that deeply. So that's my long connections. Could be one, the total time for a single session, cumulative sessions between the two systems, but I'm looking at it from a long connection perspective. The other possibility for communications is that there's beaconing taking place. So you folks talked about beaconing last week. This is that constant calling home to a command and control server. Hi, I'm here. Do you have anything for me to do? And the answer most of the time is no, go back to sleep. So I sleep for, a second, 10 seconds, a minute, whatever my timeout is set for. And now I just check back in to find out again. So there's this consistent calling out to the command and control server. We want to be able to go in and we want to tag on that as well if that type of activity is taking place. And here it is graphically. So again, that internal system connecting out to the command and control server, we're monitoring here. We want to see if any of our internal systems are exhibiting this type of behavior. That's what we want to be able to go in and detect. So what's a beacon look like mathematically? In other words, if we go in and we start running some stats and looking at numbers, what's a beacon look like? A beacon looks like this. It looks like a flat line. So if I have a system that's calling out to its command and control server on a persistent basis, and it's doing it on a very strict time schedule, I'm going to get the same number of connections per hour. So, here we're running just under 3,000. So that might be, 3,000 per hour. It might be 100 per hour. It honestly doesn't matter. What matters is that consistency. So again, one of the ways I can go in and find a beacon is I can go in and I can say, okay, I've got a 24-hour capture. So let me go in and create a data point within each hour for every session that was seen between these two systems, and then just add up each hour. And if all of them add up to be about the same, and I get a nice flat line like this, excuse me, that's telling me, yeah, I got a beacon. The other thing I can look at is the gap between the sessions. So I can go in and I can say, okay, I see the very first session that went by. Let's reference that as call that, 0. Then I can look at a relative delta to when the second session started. Let's say that was 1 second. Now I can look at the relative time between when the third session started and the second one started. If that's also a second, and then the next one's a second, and so on and so on and so on, if that relative delta stays the same every time, that's kind of what we're looking at in this chart here. This chart is looking at about 70,000 different connections, and it's saying when I take all of those relative deltas in time and look at how many different relative deltas did I see, you can see here I've got one. It looks like probably about every 60 seconds is when this thing is firing off. Okay, that's a consistency in timing. So I can find it by looking at the relative between all of them. I can find it by adding them up on like a per hour basis. The point is I need to make sure I got enough data to work with to get some valid numbers. If I have a 5-minute capture and that's it, yeah, that's just not enough fidelity to figure this stuff out. But again, if I've got 24 hours, that allows me to throw things into buckets like this to be able to get some nice pretty graphs to help me identify, do I have a persistent connection taking place? Now that's doing it based on timing. You can also do it based on size. So in other words, I have an internal system talking to an external system. If it was email or a web page or something like that, all of those sessions are going to have a different size to them, because every time I check mail, there's a different amount of, content in my messages. When I go to a web page, every web page has got a different amount of content on it. So I expect my sessions to kind of change in size a lot. But if I'm calling home and saying, do you have anything for me to do? And what I'm hearing a majority of the time is no, go back to sleep. That's the same session going out and back in. And by the way, it doesn't matter if it's in clear, if it's in plain text, if it's obfuscated or encrypted, that size is still going to be consistent. So if I'm seeing a consistency in my session sizes like that, that's an indication of that heartbeat, that do you have anything for me to do? No, go back to sleep. So if I take a chunk of data, let's say 24 hours, and I plot how big are all of my sessions, and all of them come out to be the same session size, woohoo, we're looking at a beacon. This is something we need to go in and we need to pay a lot more attention to. Now, what if I get outliers? For example, if I look at this graph, most of my data points are around 90 bytes. But I can see out here I have one at about 300 bytes, maybe a little bit less. And I've just got a single data point sitting there. What does that mean? Well, stop and think about this. And this is one of the cool things about doing a beacon size analysis. And this is the piece that most tools miss. In other words, a lot of the tools out there that say they detect beacons, they're looking at it from a timing perspective only. They're not doing a size analysis. If you run across ones that do a size analysis, please let me know. We have the patents on that, and I would love to make sure they're actually registered to use our patents. But going in and doing a size-based analysis allows me to identify, is everything just my heartbeat, or was this thing potentially activated? Because again, they call home, do you have anything for me to do? No, go back to sleep, same session size each time. If the size has changed, it's because the command set has changed. So, around 300 bytes, that may be show me all running processes in memory. And what came back as part of the session is, okay, here's a list of processes that are running on that system. It's some minimal amount of information. This is actually, it's kind of cool because notice what we've done here. We've identified it's a beacon because we're seeing this heartbeat stand out. So we're pretty certain we got a beacon we're working with here. We know it's been activated. So this is going to need to go into incident handling mode, right? We're going to need to respond to this. We're going to need incident response. And part of this is going to be a forensics process to figure out what happened. If you think about, so what information can we give the forensics team to help point them in the right direction? We can tell them, yeah, it's beaconing. Here's how we know it's beaconing. And oh, by the way, the beacon was activated at some point over the 24-hour period of time. And if I go back through the data sets, I can easily find this 300 byte session, that stands out uniquely. And I can give them an exact time when that took place. And I can't tell them what commands were done, based on what we're looking at here, but I know it's 300 bytes. So I know they did something simple like running processes, maybe an if config off the network interface, some minimal amount of information. They didn't grab all the Excel spreadsheets off of there, or they didn't start, pushing additional rootkits up or something along those lines. So while we don't know exactly what they did, knowing the size of the data transfer helps us limit the possibilities, which again helps to assist in the forensics process. Now, we can get all of this stuff right out of Tshark, which is kind of cool. This is actually something that a lot of people don't know. So with TCP dump, I'm kind of stuck with the fields that they give you. In other words, I can change the output of TCP dump a little bit by playing with the number of -v switches I use. But if I say I want to see the flags, but I don't want to see the destination IP address, you can't do that easily with TCP dump. I mean, you could, excuse me, you could write a filter around that. It'd be kind of a pain, but you could certainly do it in like Perl or Python or whatever. Tshark make no.
No, we're not going to do that. No.
Now, what's funny, John, is I think Stearns might be in this because as you were saying no, Stearns was saying yes.
Well, he's going to fire up sed and awk and all kinds of things and just make it
Yes.
happen. I just need sed, awk, some regular expressions, and we'll have this done by the evening.
Yeah, so for those who don't know Bill Stearns' official title in the company is is like director of shitty shell scripts or something along those lines. Bill's our resident hack. He's awesome at that stuff. But as you can see, I can go in with Tshark and I can specify specifically what fields I want to say. So I can say, show me source destination IP, show me the protocol, show me the amount of data that was transferred, and show me the frame delta time. Show me the amount of time that took place versus the last time traffic was seen between these two systems. This is cool because this will let me do my beacon analysis based on size. This will let me do my beacon analysis based on timing once I get rid of the zero reference in that first line. In other words, statistically, I can look at these numbers without the zero to see if there's any statistical valid information to help me identify if I have beaconing taking place. Here I can do it based on size as well, which is which is actually kind of cool. And you can do something as simple as just run rscript. So here I'm going through with rscript and I'm saying, okay, show me my minimum, show me my maximum. Now notice my mean. My mean is very close to my minimum. So with that, when we're in here and we're looking for beacons, this is an indication of a beacon. This is an indication of that heartbeat situation I've talked about. Because remember, a majority of the time when it's calling home and saying, do you have anything for me to do? No, go back to sleep. No, go back to sleep tends to be the smallest command that will come back because there's no additional data being transferred. It's not like, yeah, get me this info or write this file information or anything that's going to contain additional data with it. It's the bare minimum, bare bones, so it's going to be the smallest. So anytime I see a mean that is really close to my minimum session size, yeah, it's pretty good indication that I'm looking at a beacon here. So statistically, we can go through this to kind of figure out, is this a session we actually need to dig into a little bit further? Now, what about jitter? First, what is jitter? And second, why do I need to worry about this? And how do I deal with this if an attacker does this? So we set a beacon as a persistent call home timing. So it might be once per second, once per minute. Jitter is an attacker's way to go in and add a variable, to go in and add some variance to be able to say, okay, I want to call home about once a minute, but I don't want to do it exactly every minute, because if I do, somebody can look at my sessions and do this and very quickly figure out that beaconing is taking place. So I want to vary the timing slightly, or at least vary it enough so that somebody can very quickly and easily statistically figure out this beacon. So how do you do this? Well, this depends on the command and control tool that's being used. I have an example here for Cobalt Strike. So Cobalt Strike uses the bsleep module to identify how long do I wait between creating my call home sessions. And I can go in and I can just say, hey, do it every 60 seconds, and that's fine. But it has this third value here I can identify, which is my jitter timing. So whatever I define my timing to be, my jitter timing is a percentage variation off of that. So if I write the number 10 here, it's 60 seconds plus or minus 10%. Here I have 50, so it's 60 plus or minus 50%. So that means that I could have timing that's as close together as 30 seconds or a spread as far apart as 90 seconds as part of that beaconing calling home. Now, if I think about this statistically, with statistics, I'm going in and I'm looking for a pattern that's kind of repeating. This is trying to throw in a variable so it doesn't look so repeating. So it's a whole lot harder to go in and tag. So how do I tag this? Well, we actually kind of touched on this quickly in the beginning of the module. I'm going to dig into a little bit deeper now. But one way to do this is to do it through time buckets, meaning that rather than going in and trying to analyze each of my sessions on a per unique basis, I combine them together using some consistent metric and then compare them that way. For example, I say, okay, any sessions between these two systems that are from midnight to 1 a.m., average them up. Now from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m., average them up. From 2 a.m. to 3 a.m., average them up, and so on down. And then I go looking for my statistical variances off of those averages versus the raw data points. So I was trying to think about, like, okay, yeah, I can talk about that. And a lot of people are going to glaze over and have no idea what I'm talking about. So I figured out a nice, quick, easy way to do this in a spreadsheet that, yes, you can actually do from home too. And it's using the rand between function. So this is something you can get in Google Sheets. It's available in Excel. So what this allows me to do is this allows me to tell the spreadsheet within this cell, grab a random number between whatever values you go in and specify. Now, the B sleep example we were working with was 60 seconds plus or minus 50%. So we said that could be a beacon, beacons could happen as close together as 30 seconds, spread out as far apart as 90 seconds. So I'm going to say grab a random number between 30 and 90. And I'm going to go through and analyze that to see, okay, statistically, if someone introduces jitter, can I still go in and kind of figure out a beacon's taking place? And if I've only got a small number of data points to work with, no. Remember we said, a beacon is that flat line. When I average it out over time and I look at it, if I've got a flat line, that's a beacon. Well, if you look at this line, nope, that ain't flat. That is a huge curve that we have in here. So if we were to go in and try and do a statistical analysis on this, the numbers that would come back, quite honestly, would look like, nah, this isn't a beacon, don't worry about it. Well, we already know we're trying to simulate an actual beacon here. So that, by definition, means it is a beacon, and it's not looking like a beacon. So what do we do? Well, one possibility is use more data points. So what I do is I say, instead of trying to do a statistical analysis of all the data points against each other, like I was saying, I take everything in the first hour and then I do an average. Then I take everything in the second hour and I do an average. Everything in the third hour and do an average. And I do that for my entire 24-hour period of time. Now notice here, even though I'm seeing timing is short as 32 seconds and as long as 89 seconds, these two are kind of canceling each other out to bring me back pretty close to 60-second period of time. Look at this curve. Now it's not completely flat, but oh, we're getting closer. So now maybe if I looked at this over a 2-hour period of time as opposed to a 1-hour period of time, the more data I'm working with, the more I'm going to normalize these out and end up closer to that actual 60 value point. So, the answer here might be to say, look at it every, combined together in 2-hour blocks instead of 1-hour blocks. That might help average this out even more. That'll help normalize it out. So again, if we can go in and we can plot this stuff and we know to look for, flat lines mean beacons. So let me look for flat lines. Well, this looks like a pretty flat line. This looks like something I should go in and take a look at. So how do I detect them? Yeah, we just talked about that, right? So anytime I want to try and look for things that that are potential beacons with jitter, so what I may do is I may do my first pass and say anything that's an obvious beacon, yeah, tag that. I already know I need to review it. Anything that's clearly not a beacon, okay, get rid of that. Now, anything I'm not sure about, maybe I start doing this bucket analysis on. And if I start seeing a flat line pattern start to appear, if the timing starts looking consistent, yeah, okay, I want to go in and pay attention to that. Another possibility might be is I go in and I do a statistical analysis on the session size of each session, and I see a consistency there. The session size is consistently 100 bytes every time. Every one of them is 100 bytes in size, but then when I look at the timing, it's all over the place. Well, if I normalize it down like this, I may say, oh no, that timing is actually consistent. Someone's just gone in and introduced jitter into the whole thing. Now we're gonna get some potential false positives. So, we've got all these connections taking place going out to the internet. We don't want to have to scrutinize everything. So that's why we start with persistent connections. If it's going to be a C2 channel, there will be a persistent connection. So we start with that. And then we only need to worry about the persistent connections now. Everything else we can just ignore. Now that we have the persistent connections, now we need to figure out, is there a business need for this, yes or no? And if there isn't, that I can identify, yeah, I need to pay even more attention to it. If not, okay, that's a false positive. I can whitelist it out. Now, sometimes you can figure this out fairly quickly just by looking at the protocols being used. So in other words, let's say what I'm seeing is UDP 123 traffic, and it's going to a custom NTP server that I have out on the internet. Well, UDP 123 is NTP. And it's going to a server that offers NTP services that I know about, that I know that I've configured to use. Yeah, okay, that's, business need understandable, whitelist that one out, don't worry about that one anymore. The other one that can show up as a long connection, can also show up as a beacon, is chat programs. Slack and stuff like that. Some of them actually hold a connection open all the time. As long as that application is open, in order to be able to get immediately updated anytime somebody sends a chat. Sometimes it'll do it in like a beacon fashion. It'll just constantly check in type of thing. So either one of those, if you see it, where is it going to? And is that a potential, chat software, server that it's communicating with? That might explain the connection there. The other one you see this a lot for is dynamic web pages. So let's imagine you've gone to a website where they're showing you a map of the weather in your local geographical area, and they may update that map every 10 minutes. Well, that means every 10 minutes, some applet's going to reach back to the web server and say, hey, give me a current copy of the weather map. So I might leave that tab open in the background, or I might have it on a different tab within my browser, but that software is still going to call back every 10 minutes to say, give me the latest copy of the map. That way, anytime you look at it, you're looking at current information. You're not looking at what did the map look like when you first launched, and connected to that website, which is useful, but again, that can look like a beacon. The one that really surprised me, security software. In fact, one of the ones, I think, John, you had kind of talked about this. You guys had run into this in a threat hunt where it was security software that was actually tunneling out via DNS. So they saw what looked like a C2 channel over DNS, and it kind of was, except it wasn't malicious. It was actually, I think it was some sort of honeypot system that was connecting back to a command and control server to report, what type of weird traffic it had seen. And they needed a way to be able to call out to the server, didn't know consistently what would be available in the environment. So they said, heck with it. DNS is always there. We'll just, tunnel it over C2 the same way the attackers tunnel our traffic over DNS the same way our attackers do with their C2 traffic. So again, look at where it's going. If it's a security company, you don't be surprised, especially if you know for a fact you're using that software. But once we start tagging these, we can whitelist them out. That way we don't hit them every time. So if I'm using a PCAP file, I may create that PCAP file and then have an automated process that goes through and says, okay, anybody who was, any sessions that go to my, go to UDP 123 on my NTP server, pull those out of the file, ignore them. I don't want to see them anymore. And what's nice about that is the first time I do this, yeah, it might take me hours and hours to go through and process that whole capture file. But once I whitelist stuff out, the next time is going to take shorter. The next time after that, even shorter. And I'm eventually going to get to a point where hopefully, 10, 15-minute review and I'm done and I'm ready to move on from there. So what's next? So now that we've identified a persistent connection, again, we need to identify, is there a business need for that connection being in place? I may want to look at the protocol that's being used. I may want to look at, what the source system is, the destination system, what's the reputation of each of them. There's a lot of things we can start digging into after this that we don't have time in this hour because, hey, we're down to like the last 10 minutes. So we're going to start talking about that in the very next module. And at this point, I am going to open it up to questions. So if anybody has any questions they want to toss in, that would be cool. And John, I think everybody's got access to chat, right?
Yeah, they do. I do have a couple questions just to throw in. Whenever you're talking about that beaconing and that randomization, do you have any idea from kind of your experience just how hard it is to set up a profile that will bypass that type of beaconing detection?
Meaning, how often is it being used in malware, or how hard is it to actually detect it when it's being used?
Well, I looked at it from somebody just texted me from the perspective of how hard is it to actually create that profile. And I think this gets back into anytime you're using a computer or a program to generate something random, it's never truly random, right? It's got that concept of pseudo random. There's always going to be some type of distribution associated with it. And I think that was the question that was being asked.
Yeah. So the distinction between random versus pseudo random is exactly right. It's never truly random. There's always some non-randomness to it. And in fact, what I've noticed is that software that does like a plus or minus percentage versus a random within a range like we were using actually seems to come out closer to the median point more often. I'm not sure why, but I think it goes back to that, it's pseudo random, it's not fully random, and that may be part of the reason why that's occurring. As far as like, can I take existing malware and just make it jitter even if it wasn't designed to ever do that? It's not exactly easy. I mean, depends on the application, but
Yeah.
I'd have to go in and do some code level change in order to be able to get that to take place. In which case, I
And then,
might as well just write my own backdoor anyway and include that in.
and then we have another great question. It says the range that you use for random number was based on the knowledge of the beacon config. How do you come up with the number of unknown configs? And I think that's like the cliffs, right, Chris? So if you have a 10-second interval plus or minus 2 seconds, you're going to see a cliff at 8, and you're going to see a cliff at 12. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's so. So we knew that just so I could kind of set this up, but quite honestly, it doesn't. It really doesn't matter if I go back to that spreadsheet again. So so let's assume we don't know what the range is, okay? What I do know is the more data points I collect, the more representation I'm going to get within that range, both on the high end and on the low end, which means the more likely I'm going to be able to normalize out right at the average. So I don't need to know what it was set for by the attacker, but what I do need is as many data points as possible. That's why I was saying, here I'm using an hour period of time. That gives me around 60 data points to work with. If I use 2 hours, now I'm normalizing 120 data points. That means I'm actually going to come even closer to that average of, whatever the mean was that they were using to go in and do the beaconing. That's really the important aspect of this. More data makes this easier.
Yep. And the more data points works, and I think honestly, Rita doesn't care, right? It's going to be looking at the connection intervals, and it's going to be checking that distribution, and it could be a 60-second kind of window. As long as it kind of balances itself out and the bucket kind of fills up at a consistent rate, it's still very much detectable. Another question is, this is actually fun. What should be the focus of detection on VLAN traffic? And I think that means internal network traffic. Is that correct? I think it is. So that internal traffic, and this gets into, I'd love to hear Chris's opinions on this, and I'll talk about it. It's kind of a nightmare, but we'll pass that over. Go ahead.
Yeah. So when you look at, so a lot of this comes down to you need to understand what communications are taking place, and because the internet's scary, and because we try not to do anything with the internet that there isn't a business need for. It tends to be easier to understand all the communications that are taking place there versus random things between internal systems. So it's kind of that if it's passing my firewall, I always kind of look at it with a little cockeyed, like what is that and why is that taking place? If it's two internal systems talking to each other, if nothing's broken, yeah, I'm probably not even going to notice it and probably not even going to care. So we tend to kind of ignore it. And the problem with that is that means if we want to go in and we want to start looking for C2 communications between internal systems, let's say we're worried that an attacker has come in, they've compromised one system, and now they're trying to laterally move to other systems on our internal network, and we want to try and capture that lateral movement. You can certainly look for that, but if the internal to internal is an even bigger unknown than what goes in and out of my internet perimeter, it's going to be that much harder to tag it down. The other thing we found is that if I compromise system A and now I start to laterally move within the internal network and I'm able to compromise system B, the first thing I'm going to have system B do, beacon back out to the same command and control server. Why? Because that way if system A goes away for some reason, I still have direct communications with system B. I don't lose my foothold in that environment. If I was to do a hub and spoke where I have the one system I compromise first, everybody talk to that. Well, take that one system out and you just lock me out of your network. I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to have all of these systems connect back to me directly. That way I can keep a foothold. Well, now that's all traffic crossing your perimeter. That's all stuff you can go in and look for. So if I ID one system and I say, this looks like beacon traffic, and here's the external IP address it was talking to, the very next thing I should be doing is looking at, did any of my other internal systems talk to that IP address as well? Because if so, I got to worry about them too.
All right, and I actually did misread that. It's actually VXLAN traffic with like virtualization and cloud-based traffic, and how that actually works, since it adds some additional headers onto layer 3.
Ah, yes. Yeah, so a lot of so cloud, if it's internal cloud, doesn't matter. It's all going out your firewall. If you can capture from there, it doesn't matter if it's a cloud or if it's Amiga, an Amiga system, you're going to be able to tag C2 traffic with this. If it's in a public cloud, yeah, that becomes a different story, because now you can't sniff. They kind of design these things so that you can't, easily set things up so that you can go in and kind of tag this traffic. So what do? Now it comes down to the vendor. Some public cloud vendors don't give you any network level visibility of what goes on. DigitalOcean is probably a good example of that. Great solution, but they don't give you the ability to see network traffic, at least not that I've seen. Then you step up to like, Google or Microsoft, where you can go in and you can see like, vFlow data. And it's probably about the equivalent of like IPFix. You'll see source destination IP, you'll get some minimal amount of information, and that's it. John, you and I were talking about this recently, and both of us were like wicked giddy about it. Amazon's actually letting you do full packet captures now. So with this new solution out of Amazon, I can go into all of my EC2 instances and say, I want to capture all the traffic that they're seeing, everything they're sending, everything they're receiving, send it off to this other box, and now I'm going to run it through Zeek, so I can go in and start looking at those connections and start trying to tag, beacon along connection activity. Yeah, now I'm in great shape. But the only public cloud vendor I've seen do that so far has been Amazon.
Well, and I think eventually they're all going to head that route, right? They're going to have to, and if they want to actually be compatible with a lot of the other security appliances that are out there. With that, that's the last question. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. And Chris, thank you so much for driving today. And we can't wait to see you guys next week. I may be dropping in just briefly next week. I'm going to be on vacation, but I'm planning on trying to just pop in and say hi.
Wow, you on vacation? That would be awesome.
Well, it's weird. I'm traveling. People are like, what are you doing for vacation? I'm going to California. Oh, it must be nice to travel. I'm like, not really.
No, no, it's
not really at all. All right. Thanks again, everybody. See you at the next session.
Thank you, folks. Later.